From fitness routines to mental resilience, navigating personal goals to tackling burnout, we all need a little help with the tricky work of being human. Well, that is where the Life Kit podcast from NPR comes in. If you're looking to move with more intention or just need some thoughtful guidance on living better, Life Kit delivers strategies to help you make meaningful, sustainable change. This is much more than just a show that gives you practical advice. It gives you the support and the thinking you need to navigate some of life's trickiest decisions. For instance, we're headed into the fall. Those of us with kids or those of us in school are going back to school. This can be a pretty tricky time. Well, Life Kit has a number of episodes on how to support your kids, from setting up routines to dealing with smartphones to just trying to emotionally connect with them as they go through the tricky stuff that is being a kid and a teenager. And look, I listened to all these episodes. None of them provide a one-stop miracle cure to all of life's problems. That's not how life works. But when I listen to Life Kit, I feel more informed, more assured in my decisions, a little closer to having some of the tricky things figured out. As a parent, that's basically all I could ask for. That's not to say there aren't some episodes that are really helpful at a practical level. For instance, there's a great recent episode with tips for planning a vacation, and that one was quite useful. I think I saved myself a decent chunk of change after listening to it. So if you need help tackling common issues like relationships, finance, parenting, your career, and something that gives you a game plan that you can implement right away, listen now to the Life Kit podcast from NPR. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And it is Sunday, which is when we try and give you a little historical context for the stories playing out in the news today. We're going to rerun an episode in a minute that we did about Oliver North, but first, here for a few minutes with very important recent developments is Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
Look, obviously this is a week in which there has been a lot of news, lots of heavy news, stuff we could weigh in on. I did a little of that in our newsletter, by the way, if people want to go check that out. But there was a story earlier in this week that was about, I'd say, like a half-day news cycle, maybe?
If that, yeah.
If that. But something about it made me say, I have to get Nikki's thoughts on this. And moreover, I will tell you, I didn't read that much more because I wanted to basically get it from you, hear it from you and get your thoughts. But I take it that Oliver North is back in the news. It's a kind of gossip meets politics story. And first, we should tell listeners that you're a pretty big Ollie North watcher. Why is that? Bring us up to speed on what Ollie North's been up to over the last 40 years. And then where are we now?
Well, I'm an Oliver North watcher because I was working on a book about him that has transformed into another book, but it means that I've spent a couple of years looking at basically every existing piece of historical evidence around North. And the big story that just broke is that he was married in a secret ceremony in Virginia just a few days ago to a woman named Fawn Hall. Now, for folks who know anything about Oliver North, they will remember the name Fawn Hall because when the Iran-Contra scandal breaks, North is the center of the story, but he's there with his secretary, a young woman, very attractive, blonde, who helps him in the cover-up. So shredding papers, forging documents. She is by his side through all of this. And she becomes this kind of media figure. Actually, she's treated terribly by politicians and by the media. Politicians, so one of the things that she does is smuggle documents out of the White House.
This was during the Iran-Contra in the late 80s.
Yeah.
And North was a lieutenant colonel or something?
He was a lieutenant colonel. He was a Marine who was sectioned off to the White House, who was there in a political position as part of the National Security Council. So he's on the NSC staff, and Fawn Hall is his secretary in that position, and he builds a secret government within the government as part of what he does, and that's the Iran-Contra scandal, which listeners will hear more about in a second. But, you know, Hall is just treated like a sex object. 1987 is declared by one of the major magazines as the year of the bimbo, and they include her.
Wow.
Politicians accuse her of so she smuggles out these documents, and they accuse her of smuggling them in her bra and her panties.
Of course.
And it's just that's not where they were. And you said that because you were thinking about her bra and her panties.
Yeah, you don't know much about bras and panties if you think you can smuggle government documents, you know.
Look.
I just know the physics of that doesn't work.
Yeah, and it was just a sign in some ways that just the way that people saw her was as empty-headed, just there as a kind of sex object. And so there were all of these rumors swirling around that she and North were having an affair.
Sure.
But, you know, North was a born-again Christian. He had this wife that he was married to. They had kids. And even having been in the archives, I was like, I'm not sure there was anything here. I think this might just be kind of a media creation as part of the circus around Iran-Contra.
And particularly the Iran-Contra hearings, right? She's like emerges as kind of like one of the key figures. I mean, can you actually, on that front, can you put the hearings themselves in a sort of like media ecosystem context for us? Because it's kind of like a soap opera played out day to day, right?
Yeah, the hearings are wild. Americans tune into them. I think 80 million people tune in for the first day of the hearings. And basically, everyone in the U.S. is watching them. There's something called Ollie mania, because everyone thinks that Oliver North is the guy who's going to like bring down the Reagan administration.
Right.
And they're so excited for his testimony. They cover up the H on the Hollywood sign to make it Hollywood. They're
way.
Selling. Yeah, wow. No, it's a.
But this is liberals.
A phenomenon.
Sort of wish casting that this guy is going to be their savior.
Yes, and just Americans who had lived through Watergate,
right?
Who were settling in for the spectacle to begin again.
Yeah.
And so it really was the center of gravity, and there was a kind of mania around this story. And Fawn Hall's at the center of all of that too. And she gives her testimony. She admits, as he does, to destroying government documents. And the way that the story goes with her is, you know, I kind of followed her story out after Iran-Contra, and she kind of disappears. She makes very clear that North never reached out to her again after he was fired from the White House. She actually ends up marrying a music producer, and she's introduced through him to cocaine, and then gets addicted to crack and goes through a pretty terrible period of her life, and then kind of recedes from public consciousness. She pops up again like in 2016 as a Trump supporter, but nobody really hears from her again in any meaningful way. North, meanwhile, becomes a radio show host. He becomes a big organizer. He's on Fox News all the time in the 2000s. He becomes the head of the NRA.
He runs for Senate somewhere in there.
Yeah,
right?
He runs for Senate in 94.
But yeah, he has stayed sort of in the public eye for sure.
And he sort of dropped out of the public eye a couple of years ago. I went to his Freedom Alliance headquarters to sort of look through some of the materials that they had maybe a year or so ago. And they told me, you know, he's sort of taking a break because his wife was very ill, and she died, I think, last year. And it's in that context that the news of this marriage comes out, that he had stayed with his wife for the intervening 40 some odd years, but that whatever connection he and Fawn Hall had over all of those decades is now like legible in the public record in this one little moment where Michael Isikoff, through his Substack, figured out and revealed that the two of them had gotten married. Completely unexpected.
Yeah. So let's dig in on a couple of these details here. One is, this story that broke earlier this week. It's labeled big exclusive. This national security reporter, Michael Isikoff, on his Substack's Spy Talk, is that because they were trying to cover it up, or is that because the Michael Isikoffs of the world are the only people who are actually digging into what Ollie North is up to these days in his personal life?
They are very experienced at cover-ups, although the cover-ups they've been part of have not worked in the past. But I mean, marriages are public record. Yeah. They weren't calling attention to it. You know, they weren't writing to get a.
But it was a secret ceremony, is how he framed it, right?
Yeah, and I mean, secret could just mean private.
What does that mean? Yeah,
right.
They didn't put a listing in the New York Times,
right?
Whatever.
They're not in the vows section.
Yeah.
He's 80. I think she's like 65. So like it was a low key ceremony, secret ceremony, whatever. Like they didn't announce it, but because they're public records, I don't know if Isikoff for some reason has a Ollie North Google alert, or like he's trolling through public records on a regular basis, which actually isn't a bad idea for an independent reporter. But somehow he came across it, maybe he got a tip, and made it public.
And the other tidbit that came out was that they reconnected at North's wife's funeral, by all accounts, which, seems sketchy, but you're telling me, and I think it's true, that like North is deeply faithful, was with his wife. I mean, this isn't a scandalous. How do you read this?
It's interesting because if it had been the story that we all knew, or that North Watchers knew, which is that they just didn't have contact anymore, then why would she have been at his wife's funeral? So clearly they had still been in touch.
Or maybe the framing was they reconnected around her death. Maybe she reached out.
Maybe she reached out, right. Yeah. Who knows? It definitely opens the door to rethinking their relationship. But actually, ultimately, that doesn't matter. Even if they did have a relationship back in the 1980s, that's not the interesting story around Oliver North and Fawn Hall. It is the secret government that they were operating within the U.S. government illegally.
So let's wrap up there with your kind of take on where do you put this story on the spectrum from just interesting little gossip to it reminds us of a really key figure to, I don't know, why does it matter?
Fascinating gossip. Love good gossip about political figures, especially because people don't think about Oliver North and Fawn Hall that much. If this is people's way back into thinking about Iran-Contra, I might mention this in the episode, but people should be thinking about Iran-Contra. Sure. If you're concerned with how Republican presidents gained this impunity in their law breaking, that's not a Trump administration story. That is a story of the last 30 to 40 years of Republican governance. And Iran-Contra is a great way to see how that maneuvering around consequences and accountability really begins to take shape.
Yeah. On the gossip front, I just love this notion that everyone thought that, this guy is sleeping with his secretary 40 years ago and it wasn't true. And now finally 40 years later, it does become true. I get a kick out of that. But I will also say the other thing that this story brings up for me, which is interesting, these people don't go away. These same characters in our political drama just stick around and are around. And obviously, one of the big stories of the Trump era is that it's just dragging back a lot of folks who were sort of prominent in the 80s and they're still around and they're still affecting our politics. And I will also say a lot of the kind of younger folks are going to be around. Get used to it. You're going to see these names for many, many years. It's puts a lot, this idea that there's no second act in American politics or whatever. These people stick around for generations.
Fourth and fifth and sixth acts. Yeah. I mean, Rudy Giuliani was a prosecutor for the government back in the 1980s. He comes up in the stories of some of the special prosecutions of people like Ed Meese, who was attorney general. And then he goes through 10 other lives in U.S. politics, each one progressively more horrifying.
Yeah. Did you send him a gift? Are you going to?
I mean, I think you get up to a year after the secret wedding. So we'll see. So I'll send them a secret gift.
Great. All right.
Written in invisible ink.
Well, we're now going to rerun our episode about Ollie North from our archives, and we'll have a little interesting current context for listening to that. And we'll be back with a new episode on Tuesday. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks for joining me on this Sunday.
Yeah, thanks, Jody.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Communication is critical to your success in your personal and professional life. I'm Matt Abrahams, and I teach strategic communication at Stanford Graduate School of Business, and I host Think Fast, Talk Smart, the podcast. I sit down with experts to discuss actionable advice that you can immediately apply to your life. We cover topics like managing communication anxiety, speaking better in the moment, maximizing your influence, and how to negotiate to get what you want and need. Listen wherever you get your podcasts to level up your communication.
Well, folks, it happened. It's here. Fall is in full swing, and it is the perfect time to refresh your wardrobe with pieces that feel as good as they look. Luckily, Quince makes it easy to look polished, stay warm, and save big without compromising on quality. I am turning to Quince for all my fall staples that actually last. You've heard me talk about Quince on this show. You've heard me talk a lot about linen. Linen time, though, is over. It is now time for wool, denim, and even, dare I say, cashmere. Look, I never thought cashmere would be part of my life, but with Quince, there are actually pieces like cashmere sweaters and scarves and hoodies that are really nice and affordable. A 100% Mongolian cashmere sweater from $50. There's washable silk tops and skirts, perfectly tailored denim, all at prices that continue to blow me away. So keep it classic and cozy this fall with long-lasting staples from Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, June 6th, 1994. Actually, it was June 4th, 1994, but Oliver L. North won the primary to become Virginia's Republican nominee for U.S. Senate. Oliver North is most known, rightly so, for his role in the Iran-Contra scandal, where as a member of President Reagan's National Security Council, he cooked up the scheme to divert funds from the sales of arms in Iran to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. He also had his fingers in lots of other sketchy pies in the late 80s, to put it mildly. That scheme, we've done episodes on Iran-Contra before, but that scheme was exposed in late 86. In summer 87, North was part of the very high-profile hearings around Iran-Contra. He was granted immunity, but he was also indicted like 16 times, faced a trial. Anyway, it was a whole thing in the late 80s, very high profile, and for most Americans, that may have been the last time they saw or heard of Oliver North, until this moment, 8 years later, when North is back on the scene, one election away from becoming a U.S. Senator. Let's call this another piece of evidence that completely refutes F. Scott Fitzgerald's quote that there are no second acts in American lives. For my money, that is like the least accurate famous quote in history. There are definitely second acts and third acts and fourth acts and more in American lives. And here to discuss Oliver North's second act is, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So we should do a little of, North's history and so forth. But Kelly, do you want to start there? Just like the second acts idea? Like people just keep coming around, right?
Yeah. So even though Oliver North really has this sketchy, problematic past within the military and within, the legal world, it's interesting because he's beloved by the right. He's certainly beloved by the Christian right. People love him in the evangelical movement, which is also it's already sort of at a height. But the fact that, he is one of their heroes, I think motivates him in a lot of ways to say, hey, I've got fans. I've got people that will vote for me, that want me in this political position. And he thinks that he can really thwart the establishment by running on a platform that will sort of push back on all these ideas that he finds, to be problematic and push back on the Clinton administration and, take his political aspirations to a whole new level.
Well, yeah, we should get to that because there is a little drain the swampiness to his message here, which is very interesting given, I think, in Iran-Contra, you could say he was the swamp, but there's echoes for today. But something you said there is really interesting, actually, which is, he's beloved in certain circles. And, at first glance, you look at the story and you think, oh, there's this 8-year gap and maybe people forget and North's reputation is rehabilitated. But I think what you're getting at, and Nikki, tell me if you agree here, but actually, I think a lot of people saw North's role in Iran-Contra and him at those hearings. People on the left saw that as here's this guy talking about all these awful things that went down. But some people saw that as heroic and defiant and he was the good soldier. So there's a little bit of rehabilitating his reputation, but also just capturing and continuing what some people saw as admirable or at least, reasonable behavior.
Yeah, on the right, Ollie North was a hero from 1987 on. He was the one who was willing to do what needed to be done. The scene from A Few Good Men when Colonel Jessup is like, I'm the one on the wall. He was the one on the wall. And conservatives loved that. And it opens up this really interesting rift because who didn't love it? Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan really did not like Oliver North. And so you have this conservative movement where Reagan, in 1994, he's leaving the political scene. He makes known his Alzheimer diagnosis and he retires from politics. And here you have Ollie North, who Reagan despises and actually ends up coming out against. And the conservative movement doesn't care what Reagan says in this moment. They embrace North.
Yeah. So let's talk about the way this race plays out a little bit. We're marking here the moment when he wins the Republican primary. We should say that he goes on, he does not win the general election, to spoil it. And part of that is because there was a third party candidate who is sort of endorsed by the establishment Republicans. So this does sort of like split the Republicans a little bit. There's, of course, Chuck Robb is an incumbent here as the Democrat, and he ends up winning. So, it's not a huge shock that an incumbent Democrat wins. But North does get pretty close. He gets 40% of the vote. And there's 11% that goes to that independent. So, he's definitely viable in this race.
Yeah, he's especially viable because he raises so much money. I mean, one of the things that North taps into that is a signal fire on the horizon is he is able to raise so much money from this committed, enthusiastic base. And he is able to get those, and you don't quite have the infrastructure for really small dollar donations, but smaller dollar donations. And so he has a bank of millions and millions of dollars, and he is raising far more money than people would have expected because he's tapping into this conservative fundraising machine that is going to become, a powerhouse in American politics in the coming years.
But I'd also add that he's tapping into this very emotional, political, social backlash of the 1990s. Yeah. I see the 1990s, as this very multicultural moment, as a moment in which you have all of these different contending social factions about what is progressive and what is not. And there's new conversations about sexuality and just there's so much happening in this moment. It's also sort of like a good moment for hip hop. But when Oliver North gives his speech, he says, Virginians are sick and tired of a Congress run by backslapping good old boys and a White House governed by a bunch of 20-something kids with an earring and an axe to grind. And this, for him, very much paints the portrait of who he thinks is running the show and who he thinks is messing up, the political landscape. And then he goes on to say, I've got news for them. They will never see Ollie North crawling up the steps of the Capitol Hill to kiss their big fat rings. So I'm like, wow, okay. He's letting them know.
Yeah. Interesting tidbit there that you mentioned, the music release there. Ollie North did walk out to Illmatic by Nas for a lot of his campaign. No, I'm joking.
How could you imagine?
But yes, 94, very good year for him. You're right. But to this point, though, to your actual point about the sort of multiculturalism in that moment and the notion of politics trying to speak to a big tent. I mean, to me, this campaign feels extremely 1994 in the sense that it has maybe gotten over that notion, and it is built in many ways, and this feels very modern, right? And so you can see this as perhaps one of the first modern campaigns in this way, but it is built upon breaking up the electorate and fracturing everything and then trying to pick up as many of those fractures as possible just to get over the line. And Niki, you study this era and this kind of politics, but that seems like the real hallmark here.
Yeah, it's a real transitional moment, and you see this in the 1994 congressional elections as well, when Newt Gingrich is both running a deeply polarizing partisan campaign, but he's promoting the Contract with America, which is supposed to be this broad-based issue-focused agenda that doesn't even mention Republicans or Democrats or Bill Clinton. And so you see the splitness in this moment. And of course, the Republican Party is going to choose that first option and not the second one. But it's a party in transition. And there are a lot of other forces at work. I mean, you see in North's campaign a little bit of Pat Buchanan, right? That fire-breathing culture warrior is definitely part of North's campaign. But you also see Ross Perot. The idea of this outsider swooping in, throwing off the establishment. I mean, in 1994, everyone running for office is trying to crack the Perot vote because it had so upended the 1992 election. And that anti-establishment language, certainly not new in the 1990s, but it was intense because of the amount of the vote that Perot was able to get 2 years earlier.
But part of it feels like just a shamelessness in casting yourself as the outsider when I can't think of anything more insidery than sitting on the National Security Council and like secretly moving funds to try and like win the Cold War. That feels pretty swampy. And then like 8 years later, you just get to say, no, I'm an outsider. Let's take it to these guys.
So shamelessness, I think, is a key word here. But also there was this sense that he had gone rogue inside the Reagan administration that allowed him that kind of cover. And I think that that's what he's drafting off of.
Yeah, gone rogue was not the reason that he had to testify before.
No.
I don't think they would have phrased it as, you just went a little rogue. Yeah, but yes, I agree. I see what you're saying. Sorry, Kelly.
But in some ways, I think people link very much the military and the political machine. So the fact that he has this long career in the military doesn't quite make him the outsider that he is positioning himself to be. In some ways, I think he's very much an insider because he went to West Point, and from then on, he sort of has always had his, hand in some sort of military circle.
Yeah. So I grew up in the D.C. area, and this was like very early in my sort of just being aware of local politics and stuff. The only thing I remember from this race going on is that some of the opposition bumper stickers that you'd see on cars if you were driving around did not say Chuck Robb's name. They instead just said South. And I always thought that was very clever. Maybe a little too clever.
Sorry,
that delay suggested.
Exactly.
I was like, South, what?
Yeah. But so you'd see these North things, and then you see a bunch of cars with South on them. And, it was clever branding, and this campaign did get a little dirty in that way. And actually, there's a documentary film, a PBS, that POV series. There was a documentary about this race called A Perfect Candidate. And I watched a little bit of that, and I also watched an interview with the filmmakers on Charlie Rose. And they talked a little bit about, to put this in context, about just a couple years earlier, right, that film, The War Room, about the 92 Bill Clinton election came out. We did a group watch of that last year. And, in that film, you can kind of think of like James Carville and George Stephanopoulos as like the angel and the devil sitting on the shoulders of modern politics or whatever. Stephanopoulos still has a little bit of that like doe-eyed, speak to everyone, inspire everyone. And Carville is like very cynical, fracture the electorate, just do what it takes. And they talked about how by 94, the Carville vision had basically won. The campaign was entirely just about like, get Oliver North out there. There's no such thing as bad press. We don't care if the news is bad. We don't care, just like win each news cycle, be pugilistic, break up the electorate. And again, I think it just is an extremely 94 moment.
Yeah. Another factor here is that, Charles Robb, who is the son-in-law of former President Lyndon Baines Johnson, also sort of has some past mistakes. He, admitted to extramarital affairs. He also had some other morally questionable behavior. But that doesn't cancel him. And the fact that he is able to get reelected, I think says something about how people are able to recover from mistakes made, especially when they're honest about them.
Yeah, though that also makes me really think of this as a very modern type of election in the sense that you can run two very, very unpopular candidates against each other.
Yeah.
And they will eat into each other. And, as long as your tribe is on board, that's all that matters.
But it's interesting too, like how one woman sort of takes him down, which is Nancy Reagan. I mean, Nancy Reagan like pushes back on an Oliver North in a way that I still think has a lot of sway with voters at the time. And she just says, I know that Oliver North has a great deal of trouble separating fact from fantasy. He lied to my husband. He lied about my husband. She's not a fan, and she does not endorse him. And I think that hit really caused an election that was, somewhat close and maybe could have gotten him a victory, sort of sealed the deal on him not winning.
Yeah, you see the fracture in the Republican Party between the establishment, which is now like Reaganites, and this more fringy conservative movement that are coming into conflict in this moment.
Yeah, and especially then, Nancy Reagan says something like that 10 days before the election. It's really important to keep in mind that, if you're a Republican who is swayed by that, you don't have to sway all the way over to voting for Chuck Robb, the Democrat, because there's Marshall Coleman, who's a former Republican, sitting there as the independent.
Yeah.
And he's the one who picks up 11% of the vote. I know it's always really hard to speculate about how much of that vote would have gone to North, but, Robb beats North by 3 points, and the independent gets 11 points. And so, there's a good chance that was a really big factor.
Yeah,
there.
that's a huge percentage for independent, So those
Totally.
numbers do add up, and they do wind up taking away from a potential victory when you realize that it's such a close margin.
And we should say that Oliver North loses the Senate race, but he doesn't necessarily lose in the big picture, because what he takes out of this Senate race, he raises something like $20 million from primarily direct mail. And he takes that mailing list and continues to fundraise off of it after the Senate campaign. He starts his own conservative talk radio show. Many years down the line, he will become the president of the NRA. So he remains a fixture in the conservative movement long after this Senate race. So he still exerts quite a lot of influence, even though he is not in the Senate.
So on that point, and as we start to wrap up, I mean, how does this make you think about this moment now in terms of people who just, even if their exit from politics is a little tarnished, and I think a lot of people in the Trump administration, you can say that about them, they stick around. And they, when you have a certain level of name recognition, I suppose, that is something you can just carry forward. But I mean, do you see that playing out? Are you seeing echoes of this?
I say absolutely. I think everybody has like these moments that are not so great. But what's interesting is that give it a few years and everyone finds ways to recover or bounce back. I mean, we've seen this in very extreme ways, but we've also seen how it is totally plausible to be able to recover your reputation and start again anew.
And I'll just say, not even recover, but also like embrace and pivot and sort of own the things.
Sometimes surpass.
All right. Well, we will leave it on that note. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
My opponent is a document shredding, constitution trashing, commander-in-chief bashing, Ayatollah loving, arms dealing, criminal protecting, resume enhancing, Noriega cuddling, Swiss banking, law breaking, letter faking, self-serving, snake oil salesman who can't tell the difference between the truth and a lie.
Radiotopia.